My name is Jessie Ace. I'm part of a group of ENabled Warriors that you've probably never heard of. We're fighting back against our invisible illness and taking the dis out of disability. We don't give sympathy to our symptoms. They enable us to be the warrior that we are. If you ask doctors and nurses, they'd say what we're doing is impossible. But pushing the limits of our conditions is something that we have to break through every single day. See, we push the limits. We are mentally strong, and we can do anything. The question is, how far can we push those limits? This podcast will give you the answers. I'm Jessie Ace, and this is the Disabled to Enabled podcast. Experience the benefits of pure hive power with the bee-powered honey. This therapeutic blend of royal jelly, bee pollen, propolis, and raw honey is designed to support those heavy, low-energy kind of days while supporting your immune system, promoting mental clarity and encouraging overall balance. Try a spoonful on those sleepy mornings, napless afternoons, and before intense workouts. So go and click the link in the show note and invest in your health today. Okay, let's get into the first part of our interview with today's guest. So this section focuses on the actual diagnosis, what their illness is, and how it affects our guest. Keep listening out for part 2 to find out how they coped and thrived afterward. And then in part 3, listen out for today's guest's answers in the super quick secrets round. Or should we say not so super quick secrets round? ENabled Warriors, the next guest on our show is a 26-year-old deaf lung transplanted person with cystic fibrosis. He calls Hawaii home, but now lives in Santa Cruz, California. Oh my God, that's so cool. Diagnosed with cystic fibrosis 2 months post-birth and grew up with several antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which eventually culminated in his need for a double lung transplant in January 2017. After being hit by septic shock, he was totally deaf for about 2 years before he got cochlear implants in October 2017. He works as a publisher for dozens of columns written by rare disease patients and caregivers. And when he's not doing that, he mentors the youth and travels the world, at least when pandemics aren't involved. ENabled Warriors, please help me in welcoming the fabulous Brad Dell, everybody! Woo! Hey Brad, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Let's get straight into part 1 of our interview today by chatting about your actual diagnosis. So you were extremely tiny when you got cystic fibrosis, but what was that like to really grow up with? Like, did people treat you differently?
So I was first diagnosed because my doctors realized that I was malnourished, that I wasn't growing. And at first they thought that my parents were actually starving me, that I was neglected. And so they called the Child Protective Services, and it turned out that my parents were very, very good parents and not doing anything wrong. So eventually they started testing me for different diseases and found out that I had cystic fibrosis. And so for most of my life, it was kind of, I'd go to the nurse's office before lunch to take medicine, and my friends would always wonder what was up. But I was very secretive about my disease because I was very embarrassed about it. And as I went into middle school and high school, I slowly started telling people about it. And at first I was afraid to tell people because I thought, they Google my symptoms and they see that it's a lethal disease and maybe not want to be friends with me. Things that I think any child with a disease would be afraid of. But eventually, the more I opened up to people, the more I found acceptance. People didn't pity me like I thought they would. People weren't afraid of me like I thought they might be. Instead, I found out who would be my close friends, who are people I could trust, and who are people that might be toxic in my life, who I had to kind of loosen up in my life. And so most of my life, most people treated me really nicely. And then once I went through my transplant and all the deafness and whatnot, people started instead seeing me as someone who could, give them wisdom on life and advice. And so it moved me from a place of nobody knowing what I had to people being very supportive, and now people also being supportive of the different ways that I could inspire other people.
That's so awesome. Yeah. And it's true, isn't it? I mean, like, when you are hit with something like this, it does give you a completely different perspective on life, for sure. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit more about what cystic fibrosis actually is?
Yeah, so basically it's caused by a mutation. So it's a genetic disease that you are born with. And it essentially creates very thick mucus. So we all have mucus in our lungs and digestive system, but for people with cystic fibrosis, it's especially thick. And so that has various different effects. It creates a domino effect throughout the body. It's primarily a lung disease. And so the mucus is very thick and it kind of suffocates the airways. And also a lot of infections get stuck inside of bacteria. So most people, when they breathe in bacteria, they can usually breathe it out again. For me, it just gets stuck in the mucus. And so I also have really thick mucus in my sinuses. And so I get a lot of sinus disease. And my digestive system is also very blocked up. And so it's hard for me to absorb calories, protein, fat. And so it's very hard to gain weight. And then you also have just the side effects that come with all the medications that we take. And many people say that's really the worst part of cystic fibrosis is that we're on dozens of medications at once. And so the side effects are really brutal on the body.
Yeah, because that is often the case, isn't it? Like the side effects are often worse than the actual thing sometimes.
Yes, it's the irony.
Yeah, I know. It's like something that's supposed to help you ends up just not helping whatsoever. So
Yes.
what's it like to have cystic fibrosis kind of every day? Like what's your kind of everyday symptoms?
Yeah, so I can kind of speak to that pre-transplant and post-transplant. Pre-transplant, like I said, it's mostly in the lungs. And so there was a point that I reached where it felt as though I was suffocating every day, like I was drowning. I would breathe in and it would feel like my lungs were filled with water. And then eventually, as the disease progressed, it was like my lungs were filled with Play-Doh or clay. And so throughout the day, I'd be coughing, coughing, coughing. Throughout the night, when I'd be sleeping, I'd just be coughing constantly. And eventually came to the point where, I was coughing out what looks like cement. And yeah, and so a lot of that kind of extends to the sinuses. It felt like my sinuses were filled with very thick clay. And then there's also the digestive system. And so it's very hard to gain weight. And so in order to maintain weight, I would need to eat about 3,600 calories a day. And so I'd just be eating throughout the day, even when I was really nauseous from all of my side effects and just not having an appetite due to side effects. I'd always have to keep cramming in calories. And I'd also get a feeding tube to help me with that calorie gain. And I'd also do a lot of IV medications, both oral and IV medications, as well as nebulized medications going through every end of my body. And so most of my day was just doing various treatments, trying to get the mucus out of my lungs. That was the goal. And then I got my transplant. So the transplant is the ultimate treatment. It's the end game, you might say. And so post-transplant, I don't have cystic fibrosis in my lungs anymore.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it's been very liberating. So while I still have the disease in my sinuses and in my digestive system, really the lungs were the only lethal part. And so the lethal part is gone from me. However, with transplant comes the threat of organ rejection, which is basically your immune system sees the new lungs and identifies it as a huge bacteria. It sees it as a completely different set of DNA and it freaks out. And so your immune system can start to attack the transplanted organs. So now, while I don't really have the lung problems that I used to, and I breathe very nicely, I have average lung function, I have to take immunosuppressants. So like many other people with rare diseases, I have to suppress my immune system and make sure that it doesn't attack my lungs. And so because of that, my immune system is crippled. And so I have to be very careful around bacteria. And I'm basically on a pregnancy diet. I can't have runny eggs or rare steaks. I have to be careful with any foodborne illness. But for the most part, today is much easier. I just take a handful of pills. I don't have to do nebulized treatments or IVs. I don't have to use my feeding tube anymore because my body isn't spending as many calories trying to breathe through infection. And so I'm able to keep on my weight a lot more easily. So life is dramatically different post-transplant.
That's brilliant to know. That really is. And it must have been so scary having that feeling of cement in your lungs and Play-Doh in your lungs. Like, oh my gosh, like that must have been really scary.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call. Because throughout my childhood, I'd always hear this is a deadly disease, and it never really hit me until it came to the point where I couldn't go to sleep at night because I was afraid I'd drown in my sleep.
Oh wow.
And so to actually cough all that up, and it's a disgusting disease, really. When you cough it up, you'd realize this is actually killing me. This is suffocating me, and so it was a wake-up call. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say wake-up call, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so for most of my life, I was actually very, very bad at taking care of myself. I had a rebellious streak and came to a point where I was pouring all my medications down the drain. I was, any teenager, you have their explosion of rebellion, the hormone-fueled rage. And when you combine that with side effects and disease, it's not a very pretty combination. And so I found myself just giving up on, doing any type of treatments, thinking that I was invincible, that this disease would not catch up with me. And then it did.
Yeah. I mean, how old were you at this point?
So my disease started getting pretty bad in 9th grade. And that's when I started getting really bad antibiotic resistant bacteria. And that's when I started really heavy antibiotics. But I didn't start really getting the drowning sensation until my freshman year of college. So I was about 18.
Wow, so 18. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah.
And you're on
Fun.
mainly so you mainly have like the side effects of the tablets day to day rather than the actual condition day to day.
Yeah. So at a time I was on 4 IV antibiotics at the same time, and each one carried very vicious side effects. So ranging from causing deafness to just making me constantly nauseated.
Blimey. So let's have a bit of a chat about your double lung transplant. Now, I cannot get my head around how you would do that. That's crazy. How does that happen?
Yeah, so basically, there's an organ donor, and in America, you have to opt in. So you have to sign up to be an organ donor. And if a person dies a particular type of death, what is, I guess, crudely referred to as brain dead, that person is eligible as a lung donor. So that's usually people who have been in car crashes or who might have had a drug overdose.
Okay.
Basically a head trauma. So you're still breathing. And that donor, if their DNA matches with mine, then they are considered, a potential donor. And so the lungs are assessed to make sure that the lungs are strong enough, healthy enough, and then they do what might be referred to as a switcheroo. They put that lung set in mine. They take my old lungs out.
Wow.
And it's a 8-hour surgery, a very rather dangerous surgery. And then I wake up with new lungs. So there's a waiting list. When I first got on the waiting list, they said it'd probably be 8 to 9 months. I ended up waiting 5 weeks. I was very lucky.
Wow.
And so, I went in, got the surgery, and had to stay around the hospital for about 2 months because at a point they were giving me a bronchoscopy, a scope down my lungs most days of the week to make sure that there was no lung damage and that everything was settling in nicely. And again, they suppressed my immune system to make sure that wouldn't get in the way of things. And then they let me loose into the world.
Let you loose into the world, like a wild animal.
Like a wild animal, yeah.
That's crazy. So like, oh, okay. So to take yours out, like, did they have to take part of it out and then put part of the new one in to kind of switch them over?
Yeah, so they put me on artificial life support. Yeah, and they removed one lung at a time. So you can breathe pretty well with just one lung. And so they took one lung out, put one lung in, took the other lung out, put the other lung in. I think is
I
how it was done. Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
blew
So
my mind when I
it's
read that.
interesting.
Whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But then on the
Yeah.
downside to that, you had septic shock, like leaving you like with deafness. I mean, what on earth was that like? Would like did you come out of the surgery and then find that? And how did it happen?
Yeah. So the septic shock happened before my lung transplant. Um, Basically, in February 2016, it was my senior year of college. And I went to a retreat. And at that retreat, I got a very bad case of the flu. And of course, that's not the prettiest situation for someone with a lung disease.
No.
And I had already lost half of my hearing in 2009 due to a medication that I took. And so I was already about 50% hearing. When I got that flu virus, it seemed to have traveled up to my ear and knocked out the rest of my hearing. So it's kind of like lightning has struck twice. Two
Mm.
different reasons took out my hearing. And so I was, my senior year of college, completely deaf, still reeling from the flu that I had. And I was also on a bunch of antibiotics for a very vicious superbacterium that I had. And in the process of doing all those IV medications, somehow a bacteria, or a fungal rather, entered my bloodstream. So we think it was through improper handling of my IV. And that fungal in June 2016 just started spreading very widely into my bloodstream. And I went into a bunch of hallucinations as in the ICU. I essentially went literally insane to the point where doctors had to strap me to my bed because I was punching and kicking people and trying to tear out my IVs. And so I had entered septic shock, which is basically where sepsis or an infection in your bloodstream comes to the point where it makes all of your organs start shutting down. So my liver and lungs and heart started shutting down, got extremely low blood pressure. And thankfully, my doctors are rather genius and found ways to save me that were unorthodox. And so I kind of got back on my feet. It was a very long process of even being able to walk. And by the time I got out of the hospital, about 44 days after the septic shock had started, doctors were saying, it's time for a lung transplant, that the septic shock had so damaged my lungs that they didn't think I could go on.
God.
Yeah. So the septic shock came as a result of trying to treat a bacteria that was caused by my disease. So it was a rather sticky process. So basically, I moved from Hawaii to California to get the lung transplant. California has a lung transplant center and Hawaii does not. And I was barely able to walk. I was on very high amount of supplemental oxygen. I was completely deaf and just kind of limped my way into the transplant clinic where they decided to give me a second chance at life.
Gosh. So what was it like to be
Yeah.
completely deaf for the first time?
Yeah, so I keep telling people that being deaf was no comparison to cystic fibrosis because I was born with my disease. It was all I ever knew. To have a sense stolen from me midlife was severely traumatizing. To wake up one day and realize that you're not hearing the sirens of an ambulance or you're not hearing your alarm, and then you don't hear your girlfriend's voice, and then you don't hear your favorite music. One by one, a sound would go away. It would escape me. It was just an absolute nightmare. It was hellish. And a lot of people would say, well, why don't you just learn sign language? And, they couldn't really wrap their minds around, well, for one, I need a sign language translator. And two, I'm so busy with trying to survive. I don't really have time to learn sign language. since I had become so critically ill after I became deaf, I'd learn a sign and then I'd forget it 5 minutes later. I had no memory because there's barely any oxygen going to my brain. So it's very hard to communicate. Most people would kind of type things on their phone and I'd respond to them. But it ended up that deafness was actually an obstacle to me getting a lung transplant. So we applied to nearly every transplant center in America, and most of them just said no up front. They said we didn't even want to give Brad a chance because, one, he's deaf, and two, he has this incredible superbacterium, and they were afraid that if they transplanted me, that superbacterium would reinfect my new lungs. So the University of California, San Francisco was the only one that was willing to take me on. They set up a communication plan and a plan to treat that superbacterium. And so I got the transplant. It wasn't too fun being without music and the voices of my parents and my girlfriend at the time. But I got through somehow. Yeah.
I imagine it was quite a lonely experience.
Yeah, it's very lonely and very boring even. It really limits the activities that you can do. Conversation is burdensome. There's no music. Netflix is like, oh, you watch it with captions, but it's not quite the same.
No.
So it's very boring. So eventually I did get cochlear implants, which are kind of computers in your brain. I got them 8 months after my transplant. And through those, I'm able to hear again. Basically, there are microphones within the devices, and they sit on my ears like a hearing aid. And when sound goes into them, it transmits it into code, and that goes to the computer in my brain. And those fire signals to my brain that give the illusion of hearing. And basically, my brain adapts to that illusion, and now everything sounds perfectly normal to me again. So now I'm constantly listening to music. I love conversation. I'll never take it for granted again.
No.
So it's really quite cool in that my hospital gave me both new lungs and new ears. So I'm breathing and hearing because of them today.
That is incredible. It really is.
Yeah.
Do you think your deafness was the lowest point of your whole diagnosis, or do you think there was something else that was kind of lower?
Yeah. So I thought that deafness would be my lowest point, and then I slipped into septic shock and needed a transplant, and I thought that would be my lowest point. But it was actually after my transplant, when I was still deep in recovery, barely able to really move. I was in so much pain that I created a dependency upon fentanyl, which is a painkiller that is often cited as 50 times more addictive than morphine, 100 times more than heroin, or maybe it's the opposite. And so I had been given those painkillers to assist me in my recovery. And there came a point where my doctors had to take me off of the fentanyl. They only wanted to give it to me when I was in the hospital. And so during my transplant recovery, I was going through withdrawal symptoms also. I was very, very dependent upon the fentanyl. It was the first time I dealt with addiction in my life. And to have to deal with it while also recovering from a transplant and deaf was just not exactly what I call ideal.
No.
And so it was very, very dark period of my life where I'd just be up at night, moaning for fentanyl and wanting more of it and feeling like I couldn't go on without it. And I was also coping with survivor's guilt. So I was dealing with the fentanyl addiction while also undergoing survivor's guilt. And there's basically this thought process of, my donor died. It's very hard for me to accept that these lungs came from another person. It was hard for me to celebrate any type of victory when I knew that his family was somewhere mourning. And then I also just wondered, there are other people with cystic fibrosis, COPD, pulmonary fibrosis, et cetera, who also need lungs. And there's an organ shortage in America why am I one to deserve a lung transplant and they don't?
Yeah.
And so I was sitting there, addicted to painkillers and wondering if I deserved to even have a lung transplant. And it was just uh, this awful struggle within my mind of very guilty thinking, and wondering, if I'm just going to live my life uh, as someone who's addicted to a substance, am I wasting my chance at transplant? Um, because it was so easy for me. I could meet anyone who's addicted to something and say, no, that's not what defines you. But once you're actually in those shoes and you accept I'm an addict, it's completely different. It's mind warping, and you don't start thinking along the lines of what you tell other people. You're only thinking what you tell yourself. And I was telling myself, I don't deserve this lung transplant.
Yeah.
And so it's a very dark period. Started having, very dark thoughts, in which I wasn't sure I wanted to fight any longer.
But you did. You came out of it.
Yeah. So I was very fortunate that I was part of a very strong lung transplant support group, and that my parents were my caregivers, and my parents are amazing people. And so I was very honest with my parents and my support group, about what I was going through. I kind of downplay just how much I felt dependent upon the painkillers. I wouldn't use words like addict, but I'd say I really want that medicine and I feel like I can't get on without it. Um, and my transplant support group, it was people who were years out. They'd had their transplant many years ago, and they just kept saying it does get better. They say that over and over. They say it gets easier, it gets better. And at first that was very annoying, but with each month that passed, I'd realized that certainly it was getting easier, that the pain was getting better, my endurance was getting better, my mental health was getting better, and even, started thinking less and less about the painkillers. And so eventually, with a lot of prayer and support, I came to a point where I felt like I had control over any dependency that I had upon the painkillers. And so the moment I had that control, I made calls to my doctors and told them, I never want to have this medication again. Make sure that it's like blacklisted for me, and, moved on. And so today I moved to a point where there is no pain. There is no significant suffering mentally. And I don't have any types of cravings for that painkiller. So it certainly did get better. My support group was very honest in that things got easier, and I'm much happier today.
That's amazing. So do you think, would your main piece of advice to other people be to kind of find a community?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think that everyone should find community that's rooted in empathy, people who actually understand what you're going through, to prevent any type of, I guess, belittling. People don't really mean to belittle when they say like, it's going to get better, you got to keep pushing. But when you're actually in the midst of suffering, it can feel that way. Yeah. It's much easier to accept it from people who really honestly know what you're going through, and know that, when that person is giving me advice, they actually look like they're at peace. Maybe one day I'll be at peace and I'll be giving someone advice. And so that becomes a fantasy that eventually does become a reality. So I always advise people, find community, and listen to the voices that are, in a good place. I don't advise that people listen to those who are, just in a really negative headspace. And we all get in that negative headspace. I don't necessarily think that's a time where we need to be giving advice to people. Because it just comes down to the fact that you have the disease, and that's that. And so you might as well listen to the hopeful voices. I don't see any reason to drag myself down by listening to those who are just in a really bad place and want to tell you that you should be in a bad place too.
1,000,000%.
Yeah. So I'm happy to help those people. I don't necessarily want them to be in a place where they're helping me.
Enabled Warriors, that's it for part 1. In the next part, we will discuss the amazing things that our guest today has done since their diagnosis. Warriors, look out for part 2. And if there is anything that we've spoken about so far that you can relate to, then please tell us in the comments, and remember to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening today. Are you ready to fight back against your chronic illness and go from being disabled to enabled? Do you want to be an enabled warrior, someone who's brave, strong, and confident, and someone who's ready to find a way to achieve awesome things despite a diagnosis? This is your invitation. Check out disabled2enabled.com for articles and reviews to find out how you can become enabled too. Subscribe to the podcast to always be in the know. If you think this podcast is better than sleeping in on a Sunday, tickle that subscribe or follow button wherever you're listening. And make sure to share this episode with someone who needs some inspiration. Want to ask your questions to future guests? Make sure to join our Enabled Warriors tribe on Facebook and look out for our question posts. Before we go, check out Disabled2Enabled on Instagram for posts that tell it like it is. And remember, warriors, stay enabled.